feel so distant from you gentlemen over here. Does everybody who's been here in years past, they got their comply socks on? Just curious. There's a pair in the front row here. So thank you all for sticking out. Welcome to our panel. We're going to be talking about RegTechs accelerating the ecosystem. My name is Jonathan Frieder. I'm Compliance Technology Lead for our North American Regulatory and Compliance practice. This is actually my third year here at Comply, and each year it seems to get better and better. Really happy to be part of this, part of this program and this event. Today I'm joined by two esteemed industry colleagues that give some very interesting perspectives, dare I say, facing off perspectives with each other. We've got Ken Osbecker and we have Brian Clark. I'll let these gentlemen introduce themselves because they can do a way better job than I can.
Great. So Ken Osbecker, I'm a managing director at Evercore, primarily focused on financial technology. Have been covering the space for almost 15 years, and most recently risk and compliance, which, as you know, is such a large and important space to many financial services clients, has become an important part of our practice, primarily on the M&A and capital raising side.
Brian Clark, CEO for Ascent RegTech. I am a former regulator during the financial crisis and then flipped over and was a general counsel and chief compliance officer on the financial services side, ultimately founding Ascent a couple years back to handle a number of the regulatory problems that we saw in the market when I was practicing.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. So talking about accelerating the ecosystem, right? Talk about accelerating the ecosystem. $1.3 billion invested in fintech and RegTech specifically in Q1 of this year alone. That's 3 times the number of the same quarter last year. I'm wondering if we can start by asking you gentlemen for your perspective on what you think is driving this tremendous investment in the space in particular, and maybe give your, based on your background, your perspective on, what drove you to get into your businesses. Ken as an investor, more of an investor, and Brian more as an actual RegTech. So maybe start with you, Brian.
Sure. Yeah, so I think whenever you seek a problem or seek a solution to a problem, it has to have a bit of passion to it. It has to be something that you've experienced as a pain point. And I was certainly no exception to that rule. In 2015 and 2016, when I was practicing managing regulation across multiple jurisdictions, in APAC, EMEA, and North America, it was striking to me the costs that we incurred and the type of work that was being done consistently in each of those jurisdictions. It was, how do I solve this problem with technology? And the reason for that was, if we look at regulation, oftentimes there are groups publicly that try to remove regulation to help business, and there are groups that try to add regulation to help consumers. And this pendulum gave everyone in the industry delta, and that delta is what costs us money. So how do we try to really remediate that delta and provide technology to solve that solution? And that was ultimately where that passion came from, is kind of that bigger purpose outside of just the problem itself.
Got it. And Ken, from your perspective, what is it about companies like Brian's that would give you pause and have you look at potentially investing seriously?
So I think one of the reasons we initially became very interested in the space from a financial and technology perspective is that all of our large financial services clients were saying, look, we're spending between 5 and 10% of our expense base on compliance, and by the way, many of the times we're not doing a really great job at it. And when we're not doing a good job, we're getting hit with cease and desist and other types of regulatory infractions that are really impacting the way we're able to actually operate our business. And what they were really, often they were solving many of these problems by throwing a lot of people at it, who often actually were not doing a great job. And so they were really looking for technology solutions to help them, really run their businesses better, both from a quality perspective, but also to avoid having to pay what have been very, very expensive fines.
Yeah, we always we talk about the industry development, and compliance really missed the SaaS revolution, right? A lot of that technology was not allocated to this space, and so
right.
As you were saying, it's been a boon.
If I can go back to you for a moment, Brian. I know you're a recovering regulator, but from your perspective, what are the things that regulators or companies in general might need to be aware of from a regulatory perspective if they are in this space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think whenever we look at new technology of any kind, it's understanding that it's going to be value add, and it's going to support solving a problem more efficiently in a more scalable way, but it's not going to boil the ocean. Ultimately, it's about using that technology to advance what you're doing in a more economical way, in a more efficient way. That's really fundamental to why you're using it. The second, and I think equally as important, and we've had conversations with many of the regulators, regardless of our position, its liability will always rest with the firm ultimately. Now you can support that in a number of ways, but it's about being a good partner to allowing people to de-risk how they're managing regulations, how they're managing regulatory change, and ultimately allowing them to sleep at night.
So in terms of the solution that your company specifically provides, what was it about that particular space? Maybe you could talk about that for a moment, and
Sure.
what makes your product fulfill the things that you talked about.
Yeah, one of the fundamental premises of what we do, and this is a little bit of a theoretical concept, is that knowledge is a widget in some spaces. There are things processes that we take as people that are repeatable that we can automate. It's the same as any assembly line product that we used to build 100 years ago, and most of them are automated with machines. A lot of knowledge work that is repeatable is starting to have the same thing happen. In the case of what we do, it was going through, reading regulations, checking for changes, and ultimately analyzing the documents themselves to say, here's the one line that applies to my firm that I have to worry about, building out those regulatory changes and obligations. And that is it's a variable concept. And so we spent a lot of time building out tech to go through and support our extraction of those things, and ultimately building all of the changes and a framework for every regulatory obligation you have to follow to manage your business on an ongoing basis.
Great. I think I'd like to move real quick to recent action by President Trump. For those that are not aware, on February 11th, President Trump signed an executive order specifically on maintaining America's leadership in artificial intelligence. I want to ask each of you for perspective, maybe starting with you, Ken, on what makes that notable, and how do you think that's going to impact the industry specifically?
So I think at a very high level, it's helpful in terms of putting a spotlight on the need to invest more in AI. So it makes a number of points around asking various regulatory agencies to consider investment in AI when they're doing their budgetary work. It also talks about all the data that's held by government agencies and the importance of having large swaths of data to help increase the quality of some of the AI technologies that are coming out. So I think at a very high level, it's helpful in terms of highlighting it as an important area of focus. That being said, there's no real dollars that came along with it. And so while it asked people to allocate budgets to it, there wasn't any actual dollars that are going to being spent there. And so when you compare that to some other jurisdictions, China, for example, that have allocated $30+ billion over the next decade to spending there, I think that there's something we'll have to spend more time actually looking at how will this actually get put into play, as opposed to just saying that it would be a great idea for us to invest in this space.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It was a bit light on details that I think that would have been helpful as far as implementation, but it does de-risk firms who are interested in utilizing or starting to deploy these technologies. When we look at the adoption curve of technology, or the diffusion curve, it allows them to start to take a little bit more forward-looking view with the understanding that these technologies will at least be supported in concept by government agencies.
Yeah, and to that point, I think there's also been, prior actually to February, there were some joint statements that came out that said, look, financial institutions, we'd like you to look further into using technology in helping solving some of your risk and compliance problems. And by the way, if you look at one of these and you decide not to use it, we're not going to hold that against you. So I think that kind of goes along with the same point, under Trump's new bill.
Got it. So maybe a little bit short on specifics. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And your point about China investing, I think I saw it was about $8 billion either this year or next year being invested by the government. So maybe a little bit of a global war heating up in the AI space. Moving into a related area, I think going back to the spend number for 2019 Q1. A large percentage of that, I think 2/3, was invested in North America alone. I'm wondering if each of you are seeing, just thinking about the China number, if you're seeing investment and the space differing geographically, is North America really a leader? And are there challenges that are being faced here as opposed to elsewhere?
I think I would say, I think that was one particular year. I would say investment overall in the GRC space has increased dramatically over the past few years. And I think part of that is being driven by a few things within the actual clients of most GRC companies, which is one, it's very expensive today. Most of the problems are being solved with people and not technology. And so to the extent that your technology can save companies millions of dollars, it's certainly a very strong area for you to invest in. I think it's very unusual for us to speak to a private equity firm or some financial services client where GRC is not one of their top priorities.
Yeah, and as businesses scale horizontally too, enter new jurisdictions, enter new business lines, by magnifying the same technology, the variable cost there is always going to be the regulation. Enter a new state with your same product, you're going to be regulated. Enter another state, whole different set of regulatory costs. So those variable costs compound in ways that I think people probably didn't expect before.
And Brian, when you go out with your company, do you see differences in how the U.S. and North America in general act towards you as opposed to other areas of the world?
Yeah, there's an openness, I think, in other jurisdictions that probably doesn't embody the same level of healthy distrust that folks have back home here in government process. If I were to say it that way. There is a little bit more collaboration between agencies and government institutions overseas, and a little bit more activity just on the fringes that we're starting to note. That's anecdotal, of course, not. I think there may be more capital here, but less activity.
I think the only sandbox that I think is in play is CFPB. Do you see other regulators jumping in?
Yeah, so we've worked with a couple already. We've worked with the FCA. We are working out in London, and we actually just announced an ongoing collaboration with the GFIN, which is the Global Financial Innovation Network. There's 27 global regulators in that. The CFPB is the party to that, and we'll be collaborating with 6 agencies in Canada, Australia, Dubai, Hong Kong, and London. So these things are starting to percolate up to the top, and the market's starting to mature in a way that allows the regulators to be a part of the conversation and grow the ecosystem.
Got it.
I think part of it also will be as more of this technology, particularly in the AI and machine learning space, becomes more well-known and regulators have spent time being able to diligence some of this technology, they'll be more willing to, I think they'll be much more willing and open to accepting some.
On that point, on the due diligence point or acceptance, I think with the pervasiveness of technology, there's a number of disciplines and interests that are arising. You hear concepts such as responsible AI. I'm wondering if you gentlemen have a perspective on that and how you see the industry addressing it and the providers themselves.
Yep. I think bias in data is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face, right? When we talk about AI is a set of transformation systems, and we all know the old adage of garbage in, garbage out with respect to our data. But when you have those even not explicit but implicit biases that happen because of some imperfection somewhere, that's what leads to a suboptimal or an unpredictable outcome. And those are the dangers of allowing a machine to make decisions. You can imagine how scary it would be to get into a self-driving car that was 99.4% accurate. Right? Not many people would make that decision. And so if we want to encourage adoption, we have to increase trust, and trust comes from the elimination of these biases and really streamlining and cleaning that data in a way that allows the ecosystem to grow.
So putting your regulator hat back on for a moment, or sorry, your former regulator hat back on, what concerns do you see the regulators really having? Is it more about having the knowledge and awareness of what your processes or solutions are doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, if I were to put an even more antiquated hat on, put my lawyer hat back on, what will probably happen is we'll move at least temporarily towards an era of what we call strict liability, which means if something bad happened, you are liable. Because figuring out intent, did someone mean to, did they not mean to, is a very difficult thing to do in kind of a programming interface or even interviewing developers or data scientists. So I do think we'll see a little bit of a burden shift in that way where the liability will ultimately lie on the party that is producing the technology. So as a regulator, at the same time, you can't outsource the risk of a decision making. You still have to take on that risk as a customer, and so I think there will be a lot of play between those two things in the coming years.
turning back to Ken for a moment, picking up on your comments, what do you think, what is it that you feel firms that are looking to adopt AI or new technologies, like say Brian's, what is it that you feel they might need to do to make sure that the solution is appropriate for them, or to look out for some of these challenges? Again, given the speed, again, this whole panel is about accelerating the ecosystem. Are things moving too fast? How can firms kind of put the checks and balances in place?
I think first is they're going to have to realize they actually have a problem there. I think for many institutions that haven't yet had some type of infraction, they feel that what's happening today is okay, and it's not until they have some type of issue come up that they're actually willing to look into solutions to fix that problem. I think now that RegTech is probably in its first inning, and as the technology becomes much more well known across AML, KYC, regulatory change, and more firms adopt it, particularly larger firms, if you're Bank of America or Citigroup or someone like that that's now adopted it and you're one of their competitors, you're probably going to say, okay, I need to look at these as well, because at the end of the day, what a lot of this technology allows you to do is to be much more competitive as a player in the environment. So, for example, in the AML space, it's a much better solution, and it costs you less, and it's probably much higher quality when you're using technology versus having a bunch of people looking at profiles online. Or particularly in the regulatory change space, rather than having expensive compliance departments spending a lot of time reading emails or going through regulatory changes and hoping to find something, actually putting a technology solution in place that finds all these problems, where you actually have a culture of compliance, as we talked about earlier today, I think will really push organizations to look at these a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, so being here my third year, I mean, a lot of the same topics, the same spaces are being seen as investment areas for fintech and regtech. Natural language processing, machine learning, AI, NLG, NLP, whatever buzzword you can pick for the day. Some might say they're being overused. What are you seeing as the next emerging technology, or are you seeing something different about these technologies being used now? And maybe back to you, Brian, for a moment, given that you're using some of these technologies.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to understand that these are enabling technologies. Right? They aren't going to solve the problem of regulatory change or AML analysis itself. In the same way that we don't use computers to provide the service, we use computers to provide the services and products to our customers. We don't give the computer to our customers, right? These are, I call them kind of cognitive tools, and really they help us build things more efficiently. Computers are about speed, and what AI adds to that is complexity. So now you can handle more complex scenarios more intelligently and much quicker. And so when you combine those things together, it allows us to provide new solutions that we couldn't before. Doing what we've done with our systems would require roomfuls of human capital, and that would not be an efficient solution for our customers. And so the technology is enabling in the sense that it allows us to create these new products and services.
So on that note, if you can continue on for a moment, what is it that firms that are looking to get into this space, we come across a lot of technology providers that don't even necessarily have branding or product tagging on their solutions yet. They're in a way looking for a problem to solve.
Yeah.
What do you feel firms that are operating in this space need to be doing to be successful?
So there's kind of two things I'd say to your point. Don't be a hammer looking for nails. Find the nail first, figure out if it's a nail or a screw, then build the tool that you need to solve the problem. It sounds simple. It's very often a difficult thing to kind of hammer home, pun intended. That's really the first recommendation. The second is get in early and be aware of how long sales cycles are for a lot of the largest financial institutions. There's a lot of movement being done to help support that accelerating, but oftentimes you're at the whim of, and not necessarily in a bad way, there's a lot of protocols and a lot of processes that folks have to go through at institutions. They aren't a startup, right? They don't have 6 people in a basement room, right? So it's about understanding and shepherding those processes, but starting early and making sure that you're really supporting your go-to-market strategy as your product develops and evolves.
Sure. I mean, I as a consultant being out there working with some companies like yours, I can say that the days of the free proof of concept, I think, are long gone. Firms are very reluctant to come in and do free work. Turning back to you for a moment, Ken, and picking up on Brian's comments, at what stage do you tend to take a serious look at some of these companies, whether they're emerging technology or not? Are you willing to take an investment stake in a company that may have promising technology but may not be widely known yet?
I think it's less to do with the actual stage or size of the company, but more of the actual problem they're solving. And so kind of to your point, Brian, earlier, and actually trying to have a solution that you're solving and not in search of a solution, or in search of a problem rather, having a piece of technology that is a must-have piece of technology. I think that's more important than the stage or the size of the company. Because you want to have a technology solution that when the CEO wakes up at night, this is the 1, 2, and 3 thing they really care about. And so if your solution is able to solve that problem, that's hugely valuable to them. Or if their problem today is that they have a bunch of people sitting and reviewing, doing tons of manual work and not being able to actually utilize their intellectual capabilities to do things that would be much more value add, that would be another thing that would be really important to have.
And talking for a moment about the cultural challenges that Brian alluded to, do you take a close look at how a solution or product or company may fit out in the industry as part of what you look at? Meaning, does it have a likelihood, a probability of success, or does that not come into the picture for you at all?
No, that certainly comes into the picture, particularly in terms of what is their ability to sell into various institutions today. As Brian mentioned, sales cycles in financial institutions tend to be longer than most other industries, given the regulatory overhang for most of those institutions. So making sure that you actually have a platform that's been architected and thought about in advance about those issues that you'd have to jump over, making sure that you yourself are in compliance and being able to kind of pass through various firewalls and other things that will be required of your clients.
So actually you raise a good point, alluding to some of the regulatory concerns that some of the solution providers themselves need to be aware of before, again, rushing out into the world that they may be looking to get involved with. Brian, what kinds of challenges do you see from a regulatory perspective that firms like yours need to be aware of?
Yeah, we talked about it at the beginning. Regulation is a tax. Now, often it's a very socially positive tax, net. It's very beneficial, but it still creates a barrier to entry, and startups in any industry are no exception to this, whether it's in RegTech, which is ironic, or others. Things like GDPR, data privacy, obviously the California rules coming into play, are one piece of it. But when you look at implementations and your capabilities to manage your internal risks from intrusion, cybersecurity, things like third and fourth party risk, those are things you have to consider at an early stage, and it's better to build them into your process because it reduces the friction that you have later on. And that just allows you to get through those kind of check the box items that are table stakes when you're working with some of the most highly regulated and appropriately so institutions in the world.
So, I mean, you're actually making a good point. It's like checking the box as a provider yourself, right? If you're going in to solve a problem in the compliance or risk space, the things that you need to be aware of would be the types of things that the firms you're looking to solve problems for, they apply to you as well.
Correct.
So third-party risk, fourth-party risk, data privacy, having a risk management plan, a business continuity plan. Mm-hmm. These are some of the things that I know that we get questions about. Maybe this is a good segue to talk about, so what are some of the critical success factors, and maybe starting with you, Ken, when you're looking at companies and based on your experience in the industry, what do you see as being the most critical success factors for companies looking to get into this space?
Sure. I think one point, as we kind of mentioned earlier, is actually having a really good understanding of the regulatory landscape. And what do I mean by that? So, I think there's been a lot of great technologists that can build solutions for regulatory problems, but don't really have the regulatory background. And so I think companies that have a mix of both technology expertise, but also that regulatory background as well, whether it comes from someone from a regulatory agency themselves or has just spent a lot of time maybe working within the regulatory part of a bank, for example. So I think that would be one part. I think too is actually having tremendous amounts of automation within within your company. So, if you might be great at servicing some small institution, but once you're kind of scaled up to a much larger client, to the extent that you haven't actually automated as much as you can within your own organization, those things kind of begin to fall down. And then your solution is obviously not as valuable in terms of being able to service a larger client, which is where most people will want to move to eventually.
How about from your perspective, Brian?
Well, I think scale's the big one. You mentioned it here a moment ago. It's the ability for the technology to help pull your business as opposed to pushing it and pull you forward. I think that's hugely important from continuing to grow the value you're providing customers.
I think also just being able to prove that you're going to be around, right? So from a financial institution's perspective, you're not swapping in and out your regulatory vendors on a regular basis. And these are hugely challenging pieces of technology to implement within your organization. So, most of our clients will spend a ton of time making sure that organization will be around in 3, 5, 7 years so that they don't have to, go back and start from square one again, another year or two if that company seems to go out of existence. So I think there'll be a lot of diligence done around that as well. And being able to prove that out, I think, would be quite important.
How about from a preparation, if you flip it to let's say the firms that would be looking for solutions for RegTechs, what do you see as being the fundamental things that they need to be doing, whether it's prepare their architecture, their technology architecture? You talked about cultural change before. What are some of the things that you see as being required?
There's one really big key here, and it's acknowledge that some of these tools may find opportunities to improve. Now, that's a very PR way of saying there are gaps.
You guys aren't perfect out of the gate?
No, I'm saying it will find areas in a firm where there are gaps. It will show you things where you have missed pieces, missed changes, missed items to audit. And you really have to make sure that there is a culture established that empowers people to find those things rather than punishes them for not having seen them before. That is the one thing that will absolutely stop any new technology in its track and create fear. And fear is the worst thing you can do when you're trying to create a culture of compliance, grow an organization, and really protect it. If you empower people to say, hey, every time you find something that's been missed, we're going to, not necessarily a reward culture of that, but really empowering that behavior pattern is really important.
I know when we go in and we're working with organizations that are looking to invest or bring in fintech and RegTech solutions, it's really important to time box and set expectations, going back to the cultural point. I guess, going back to you for a moment, Ken, do you generally time box an investment before you kind of declare it a success or a failure? Or how does that work?
I mean, I think it's being able to kind of prove out various milestones, right? So you kind of set milestones in place. Some things are constantly being changing in the space, and as Brian was just mentioning, sometimes things take longer than expected, particularly when it involves some type of cultural change or change within the mindset of an organization. Those things take longer often than one will expect. And so I think kind of having time boxes around things is pretty challenging, particularly in this space.
Yeah. I know we're running up towards the end of the panel. I want to just thank both of you gentlemen for your insights today, and thank you all for being a patient audience.